This is where we're going to pick up part 3 of chapter 1, which is the last section of that chapter. So, in this kind of current day and age, psychology is accepted as a science. Okay, but I can tell you that there's kind of a misunderstanding around that and some debate. Okay, so the first thing that you need to know is that psychology is very young as a discipline. When you compare it to other areas of science like biology and physics, the first psychology lab was only founded about 140 years ago. So this is a new concept in the grand scheme of things. Of course, there were many great scholars, writers, philosophers like Aristotle and Shakespeare that asked a lot of questions long ago that could be considered psychological. Like Shakespeare wrote about unconscious motives and jealousy and emotions, and Aristotle. I mean, these are very well-known scholars that again existed a long time ago that could maybe be given credit as asking some of the first psychological questions. But we also have to acknowledge that we really can't point to psychology as a field until it became more scientifically based, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I also very much appreciate that your textbook talked about that psychology as a field has been heavily dominated by white male scholars, and that has certainly changed in the last I would say 30 years or so, and we're making great gains there. But I think it's important to keep that in mind because a lot of the early history and our early understanding of people really came from a very biased perspective. And so that's another reason that, not only was the first lab founded 140 years ago, but our field has really only been starting to represent all people more recently. And so there is a lot of room for growth. And so I think that this is just such an exciting time to potentially be, a young psychologist. So for those of you that are thinking about majoring in psychology, there's just so much work that needs to be done. And I just think that it's a really promising field. So just to kind of get back on track, so the reason that psychology kind of comes from this place of misunderstanding is that a lot of the first scholars didn't really do high quality research. They did most of their work based on just kind of their random observations of individual cases. So the kind of typical, and I'm putting air quotes around researchers, you just can't see it right now. So air quote researchers back then were just dealing with a small number of people and just kind of basing it on their own opinions and their own experiences. And hopefully based on what I've just spent 30 minutes talking about, you see the problem with that. I hope you're picking up on the problem with that. So the field of psychology kind of has this misunderstanding in terms of its early days because it really did kind of evolve out of some problematic methods. But more recently, we really have seen high quality research coming out. Okay. So again, kind of as a side note, even though they were basing their knowledge on these kind of problematic sources of information, they weren't all wrong. Back in 460 BC, Hippocrates started to talk about the brain as a source of emotion, and that's not wrong. That's something that we know. We now know a lot more about it than that, but that piece of information itself is not incorrect. Looking at how the mind kind of processes experiences and then how it forms associations between the ideas from those experiences. Those thoughts weren't wrong. But really, we didn't see science in this field until 1879 in Germany. Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psychological research lab. And from that moment, we were off and running as a science. Yes, there was still a variety or a range of quality of that research, but at least it was more scientifically based. And so once we were founded as a science, there were kind of these three main ways of thinking about things. And so the first one, structuralism, was built on this kind of original way of thinking that Wilhelm Wundt founded. And so Wundt's research looked at kind of sensations and then like emotional expressions. And so very kind of how we experience things is what Wundt looked at. And so that kind of developed into structuralism, which is kind of a focus on breaking things down into basic elements. So if I were to ask you as homework to go get an orange and to cut it into beautiful little pieces and eat it and just kind of sit in the experience and think about the taste and the moisture and the acidity and the texture, just kind of breaking down what that experience is like. That is structuralism. So it took a holistic experience and broke it down into elements. So essentially it's interested in the what is happening. That's problematic though, because to break down experience into individual elements, we're losing a lot of it. And so this then developed into a kind of newer way of thinking, which was functionalism. And so that was focusing on the how and the why. And so by expanding the field to talk about more of the causes and consequences and not just kind of breaking down the individual pieces of experience, psychology really flourished in terms of expanding into other areas of explaining people or understanding people. And so from there, we took one more leap towards psychoanalysis. So if you know anything about psychology, you have heard of Sigmund Freud. So he was a neurologist, 19th century. And so he's kind of credited as one of the founding fathers of psychotherapy. And so by psychotherapy, I just mean, where individuals see therapists to work through their mental health difficulties. And so what he founded was this school of thought called psychoanalysis, which is a theory of personality that's going to emphasize the unconscious motives and conflicts. So Freud very strongly believed that there's a lot more to people than what we have access to. So if I were to ask you, well, what do you think drives you, or why are you the way you are? Freud would say, well, that's a problematic approach because people don't even fully understand or have access to all the things that make them who they are. That we need to kind of take a different approach to getting at who people are. And so, psychoanalysis was one of the first approaches to addressing psychological difficulties. And we'll return back to this in a much later chapter in the class talking about psychological disorders and treatment. But essentially, these were kind of the first primary schools of thought that psychologists relied on to try to ask their questions in a kind of in a science-directed way, and then collect evidence to address those questions. But more currently, we have four primary schools of thought. Structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis, those are old school. Okay, I just kind of offer them as an initial thought of how research has been conducted and kind of where the field started. Okay, but let's shift gears to talking about currently. So I think these terms are kind of obvious, and I know you guys have read the chapter, so I don't want to spend too much time here. But by biological, we're talking about the nervous system, our hormones, chemicals, substances like neurotransmitters. And so the biological perspective is essentially going to ask about the physical state aspect. So let's return back to the example of a soldier in combat. So what we know is a lot of soldiers that are in high-risk combat situations experience post-traumatic stress disorder, that I think most of you are fairly familiar with, but, maybe the person isn't going to sleep well, they might feel jumpy, they might not want to talk about what happened, they might kind of feel irritable or angry. So there's lots of symptoms of PTSD, but that's kind of generally what it can look like. So the biological perspective is going to say maybe there is something biological to that person that placed them at higher risk of developing those difficulties. So there is research coming out that there are certain neurotransmitters, or at least activity of neurotransmitters linked to PTSD symptoms. So that would be one explanation from that school of thought. Learning is how the environment and our experiences are going to come together to impact people. And so a learning perspective on PTSD would be that the person learns to associate, let's say, loud noises with danger. Because when you're in combat, a loud noise might mean an explosive device just went off and someone could be injured or killed. And so that learning experience then impacts us in the future, because then when we hear a loud noise in the future, we assume something bad just happened or is happening. Cognitive, on the other hand, is how we reason or how we explain experiences. And I can tell you, thoughts are one of the biggest things that drive PTSD symptoms. So maybe a soldier's having thoughts of self-blame, If I had done more, my buddy wouldn't have died in combat. And so that self-blame could lead to sleep difficulties, for example, or the thought could be my family will never understand what I went through. And that could lead to social isolation. And then the last one, which I just think is so important, and I love that the field of psychology has a growing appreciation for it, is sociocultural, right? So social and cultural influences, things like gender norms. So a huge one for veterans is that the veteran identifies as male. Masculinity is a huge influence on people, dealing with PTSD. So I've worked with a ton of soldiers that they felt like they had to be strong, that to admit that they were struggling showed weakness. So sociocultural factors are certainly huge to consider as well. So these four, schools of thought, this is kind of where the field is right now. Researchers and scholars often kind of follow one more than the other, but there's often overlap. So I would say, as a scholar, I'm mostly a cognitive researcher or scholar. But sociocultural, that is a growing influence on my work. And I appreciate both biological and learning influences as well. So don't think that these are kind of mutually exclusive categories or identities for researchers. There's a lot of overlap. So what do psychologists do? I kind of, jokingly talked about the airplane experience I often have, but I think people misunderstand the field. Our activities typically fall into one of these three main categories. We either do, kind of class instruction or research in a college setting, or we provide health services of some type, or we do some type of application of findings to some type of a non-academic setting. So those are kind of three kind of rough categories. I see a ton of overlap between them. That's why I say they're kind of rough. But generally speaking, our activities fall into these three groups. And so that means that we end up doing a lot of different things. So in terms of the topics we cover, as researchers and teachers, there's a lot of variety here. We do a lot of cool research that might be education based or might be, looking at how people develop over time. In terms of the settings that we work in, if we are providing mental health services, we can work in, state hospital. So I've worked in a state hospital before. Sometimes we work in like community clinics, private practice. I worked in a jail for a little while. And then, looking at the areas that we can apply our research, sports psychology is a huge one. Once athletes get into slumps, sometimes a sports psychologist will come in and help them kind of work through that because it often gets in their head, right? They have a hard time getting back on track and having confidence. Opinion polls, military. Really the areas that psychology can help and inform are so vast that, this table just doesn't even do it justice. So that's the end of chapter 1. Again, I hope I provided a few different examples or highlighted things a few different ways than the textbook. Certainly let me know if you have any questions. That's the end of chapter 1. Thanks for listening.